She stood before 10,000 wolves and let them watch her burn. Not with fire, with silence, the kind that crawls under your skin and stays there. Luna Serafina Vale had spent 7 years building an empire beside a man who couldn't even meet her eyes when he handed her away. That's not heartbreak. That's erasure. And the worst part? She still believed it was her fault, but something ancient woke up that day. Something the royal bloodline spent centuries trying to bury. Stay close, because what comes next will shake you down to the bone. Drop your city name below. I want to know where in the world you're watching this unfold. And if this story hits you somewhere deep, you already know what to do, Shets. The morning of the grand ceremony of alignment, Serafina woke before the sun had any business rising. She lay still in the enormous bed that had belonged to her and Darius for 3 years, staring at the ceiling of the Luna's chamber with the particular stillness of a woman who had trained herself not to reach for the warmth beside her. That side of the bed had gone cold 3 months ago. Around the same time, Queen Mother Celine started having Liliane's portrait touched up in the lower galleries. Serafina had noticed. She'd said nothing. She'd learned long ago that noticing things in this palace was its own kind of violence. Outside, the capital of Nocterin was already burning with preparations. She could hear it through stone walls 6 feet thick, the drumming crews down in the harbor quarter, the vendor stalls rattling up along Sovereign's Walk, the distant howling of the ceremonial horn wolves being led in from the northern kennels. The grand ceremony happened once every decade. It was the moment the Alpha King publicly renewed his sacred bond with his Luna before the moon goddess and every living subject of the empire. 47 noble houses would be watching from the gallery tiers, thousands more in the plaza below. Serafina rose without calling for her handmaids. She crossed to the window and stood there in her shift, looking down at the city that had never fully accepted her. She was not highborn. That was the polite way to say it. The crude way, the way she'd overheard 2 generals use in a corridor 4 years back, was that Darius had brought a valley girl into the throne hall and tried to dress her up as Moonfire. Her father had been a boundary wolf, a soldier who died holding the eastern passes. Her mother had been a midwife in the outer settlements. She'd been Darius's choice alone, against his mother's considerable wishes, and she had spent every year since trying to be worth the choosing. The mirror across the chamber showed her a woman who looked older than 26. There were shadows beneath her silver eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. Her dark hair had grown past her shoulders, thick and unruly, in the way that the palace stylists were always trying to tame with oil and pins. She was tall, built lean and strong from years of running the outer training circuits with the border packs. Not soft, never soft. But standing in that morning light, she looked, even to herself, like something that had been carrying too much for too long. She dressed herself. No help. She wanted no one in that room with her today. The Queen Mother found her in the corridor an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Celine moved the way she always moved, like the palace itself owed her passage, like the stone floors recognized her footsteps and parted slightly in deference. She was 53 years old and looked 35. Her wolf form was said to be the largest female in recorded imperial lineage, a pale silver beast the size of a draft horse. In her human form, she wore that power like jewelry, effortless and deliberate. She stopped 3 feet from Serafina and looked at her the way you'd look at a piece of furniture you'd been meaning to have removed. "You look tired," Celine said. "I slept fine." "I didn't say you looked unwell, I said you looked tired." She tilted her head, and something in the angle of it reminded Serafina of the wolves in the kennels, that particular quality of attention that precedes a strike. "Today is a significant ceremony. The Empire will be watching my son." "And his Luna," Serafina said. The pause that followed was so small, so precisely controlled, that most people would have missed it. Serafina had lived in close proximity to this woman for 7 years. She caught it the way you catch the smell of smoke before you see the flame. "Of course," Celine said. She smiled and walked past. Serafina stood in the corridor after she'd gone, breathing very carefully through her nose. There was something wrong. She had lived long enough in this palace to know the texture of a trap, and today the air tasted like one. She found Darius in the preparation chamber off the main hall. He was in his ceremonial armor, black iron, trimmed with hammered silver, the crest of Noctarin's twin moon sigil on his chest plate. He was 30 years old and looked every hour of the power he carried. 6'4", built from years of military campaigns in the Western Territories, with the kind of jaw and posture that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. His dark eyes found her when she entered, and then, with a quality she recognized with the precision of someone who had been cataloging it for months, they slid slightly to the left. She stood still inside the door. "You're not wearing the crown pendant I sent up," he said. "It didn't fit right. It was made to your measurements." "Darius." She kept her voice flat. "What is happening today?" "It's the ceremony of alignment. You know what it is." "I know what it's supposed to be." She stepped closer and dropped her voice because there were 2 attendants across the room pretending to be invisible. "I want to know what it actually is." He turned to face her fully, and she watched him do the thing he'd been doing since winter, the thing she'd started to think of as the erasure, where his eyes went flat in a particular way and his expression settled into something careful and controlled and entirely without the warmth she'd fallen in love with a decade ago. He was not a cruel man. That was almost worse. Cruelty would have been easier to fight. "You're going to stand beside me," he said. "The ceremony will proceed. Everything is arranged." "Is Lillian going to be there?" The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "She is a guest of my mother's," Darius said carefully. "She's been a guest of your mother's for 5 months. She sleeps in the East Wing. My handmaids have been reassigned to her household 3 at a time." Serafina heard her own voice, steady, almost toneless, which was the register she reached when she was past the shaking. "I'm not asking you to explain your choices to me. I'm asking you to tell me the truth about what happens on that platform today." He said nothing, and in that silence she understood everything. Tom. The Plaza of the Twin Moons could hold 18,000 people, and on this morning it held every last one of them. Serafina walked out onto the high platform behind Darius in her proper place and felt the roar of the crowd rise up and wash over her. She had stood in public spaces enough times to know how to receive that sound. Head up, shoulders back, eyes ahead. She had trained herself to look like she belonged here because the only alternative was to look like she didn't, and she had never once given Celine that satisfaction. The platform was 40 feet above the plaza floor, flanked on either side by massive carved stone pillars wrapped in silver chain. The ceremonial fire burned in a basin at the center, pale white-blue moon source flame that could not be extinguished by ordinary means. The High Arbiter of the Empire, an ancient wolf named Vorin with a face like dried leather, stood at the basin with his ceremony scroll. Noble families packed the gallery tiers on either side. 47 houses, thousands of faces, and every single one of them watching. Serafina took her place to Darius's right, as she had always done. She did not look at the section of gallery where she knew Lillian would be seated. She had made herself a promise about that. Vorin raised his staff, and the plaza fell into a silence so complete she could hear the chain links on the pillars swaying in the wind. "People of Noctarin," Vorin began, his voice amplified by the resonance architecture built into the platform's stone. "We gather in the sight of the Twin Moons to witness the renewal of the sacred bond. The Alpha King stands before his empire. The bond between Crown and Luna is the foundation upon which—" Celine stepped forward. She walked onto the platform from the eastern entry, and she did it with the absolute calm of a woman executing a plan she'd been designing for years. She wore white, the lunar white that only the Queen Mother was permitted to wear, and her silver hair was piled high. She crossed the platform without hurrying and came to stand beside Vorin, and the old arbiter stepped back with a deferential incline of his head that told Serafina this had been arranged in advance. The crowd murmured. 47 noble houses leaned forward. Serafina did not move. "My son," Celine said, and her voice carried across the plaza like it had been born to fill exactly this space. "The Empire has watched and waited. The Moon Goddess demands a true bond, not a political arrangement born of sentiment." She turned, and for the first time she looked directly at Serafina, a look so clean and merciless it felt like the edge of a blade. "The Luna of Noctarin must be bloodworthy, born of bloodlines that carry the ancient covenant. We have waited 7 years for a sign that this bond carries divine sanction. She paused. No sign has come. The murmuring in the crowd deepened. Someone in the noble galleries made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite laughter. Serafina turned her head and looked at Darius. He was looking at the fire. A new bond must be established, Celine continued, her voice sweeping the plaza with ceremonial authority. One that carries imperial bloodline and divine lineage in proper measure. She turned and extended one hand toward the eastern gallery. Liliane Asheville of the Highborn Human Compact, bound by treaty, sanctioned by the covenant of ancient alliance. Liliane walked out. She was everything Serafina was not, and Celine had arranged her to be. She was small and golden-haired and moved with a kind of deliberate fragility that read as elegance from a distance. She was wearing silver, technically forbidden for anyone who was not Luna, but nobody on that platform was going to say a word about it. She walked to Celine's side and then turned to look at Serafina with an expression that was either pity or something much more complicated. The plaza was very, very quiet. Serafina heard her own heartbeat. She stood absolutely still and ran the calculation that 7 years of surviving this palace had taught her to run in the space between one breath and the next. She knew what Celine wanted. She wanted Serafina to break publicly, to raise her voice, or weep, or lunge forward. Any of the responses that could be written into history as instability, as proof that she had never been worthy of the title. Every nerve in her body wanted to oblige. She did not oblige. She turned to Darius. He was still looking at the fire. "Darius," she said, and the amplification architecture carried her voice across the entire plaza with a clarity she hadn't intended. Every face in 18,000 turned toward her. "Look at me." A long, unbearable pause. He turned, and she saw it. The thing that was worse than hatred, worse than indifference. She saw guilt. She saw a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and who had decided to do it anyway, and who had the decency to feel terrible about it and the cowardice to do nothing with that feeling. She had loved him for 10 years. She had crossed social chasms for him and held her tongue in front of his mother for 7 and run his border patrols and raised herself to his standard by sheer force of will. And she could see in his eyes that he knew all of it. "You're going to let this happen," she said. Not an accusation, a plain statement of fact. Darius said nothing. Serafina looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she looked out at the 18,000 people in the plaza below, the common wolves, the merchants, the soldiers who had fought under the Luna's banner, the women in the back rows who had brought their children to watch the ceremony. And she felt something inside her shift. Not break. Shift. The way a foundation stone shifts when the ground moves beneath it, reconfiguring to bear a new weight it hadn't been asked to carry before. She stepped back from her place at Darius's right hand. The crowd erupted. She walked off the platform with her spine straight and her hands loose at her sides, and she did not run until she was through the interior door and into the preparation corridor and around 2 corners where nobody could see her. Then she ran. Not from fear. She had stopped being afraid of this palace a long time ago. She ran because her body needed to move or it was going to tear itself apart. She ran down the service corridor, through the lower kitchens, out through the postern gate that opened onto the alley behind the South grain stores. She came out into a narrow street 3 blocks behind the palace wall, with her ceremonial gown muddied at the hem, and her breath coming hard through her teeth, and 18,000 people still roaring in the plaza a quarter-mile away. A vendor was watching her from across the alley with a load of root vegetables on his cart. He was a common wolf, maybe 50, with the kind of face that had seen things and stopped being surprised by them. He looked at her ceremonial clothes, her disheveled hair, the expression she probably couldn't fully control right now, and he said nothing at all. He just turned his cart around and went the other direction. That small courtesy nearly undid her. She pressed her back against the stone wall and breathed. The roaring in the plaza had changed tone. She could hear it even from here. No longer celebratory, something more fractured and uncertain, the sound of a crowd that had witnessed something it didn't have a ready framework for. She wondered what Celine was doing up there now. Probably proceeding, probably making it graceful. Celine was very good at proceeding through things. She pushed off the wall and kept moving. Cheb. She had one person in this city she trusted. Marin was 40 years old, built square and hard from a life spent in boundary wolf work before a leg injury retired her to the city. She ran a cartography shop in the Old Quarter, and she had been Serafina's closest confidant for 4 years, acquired not through court channels, but through the kind of accidental honesty that happens when two people are stranded together in a rainstorm and have nothing to lose by saying true things. Serafina came through Marin's back door without knocking and found her at the large drafting table with a pair of reading lenses on her nose and a cup of something hot at her elbow. Marin looked up, looked at the state of her, set down her pen. "How bad?" Marin said. "She did it in front of everyone," Serafina said. "Voren was part of it, prearranged. Darius didn't say a word." Marin pulled off her reading lenses. "And the human girl?" "Was already on the platform, silver dress." Serafina sat down on the work table stool because her legs had decided they were finished performing. Celine had it timed to the half-second. This was months in the planning. At least a year from what I can trace back. She pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the grain of the wood. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she found interesting. She'd thought she was past the shaking. "She's been building the legal case since before winter. The divine sanction framework. If there's no sign from the moon goddess after 7 years of bond, the Luna can be ruled ceremonially incompatible. She found the clause in a pre-imperial covenant text that hasn't been cited in 400 years. That text requires 3 high arbiters to convene, not one. Voren was the only one who needed to stand on that platform." Marin sat back. "And the other 2? Are probably receiving letters about their new posting assignments as we speak." Silence in the small shop. Outside, the city noise had changed. The drumming had stopped, replaced by a lower, more dispersed sound. People processing what they'd seen. "Where do you go from here?" Marin said. It wasn't really a question. Serafina looked up. "I don't know yet." "You have resources, your boundary networks, the Eastern Compact contacts. Those contacts exist because I'm Luna," Serafina said. "In about 4 hours, a formal decree will come through. I won't be Luna anymore. I'll be a private citizen with no house, no title, no legal standing to hold contracts or command loyalty. Everything I built in that position disappears with it." "Not everything." Serafina looked at her. Marin met her eyes steadily. "What you know doesn't disappear. What you are doesn't disappear. 7 years of learning exactly how that palace works. That doesn't belong to Celine. She can't strip that out of you with a piece of legal text." Serafina rubbed one hand across her face, a rough, tired gesture she'd never have allowed herself in the palace. "The people in that plaza," she said quietly, "the common wolves in the back rows, some of them were angry, not at me. I could hear it." "What did it sound like?" "Like something tearing," Serafina said. "Like when you pull on a piece of fabric and the first threads start to go." Marin nodded slowly. She reached across the table and pushed the hot cup toward Serafina. "Drink." Serafina stayed at Marin's shop through the afternoon while the formal decree worked its way through the palace bureaucracy and the city tried to make sense of what it had seen. She drank 2 cups of something bitter and sat with the shape of the day, running it from the beginning, looking for the pieces she'd missed. She hadn't missed many. That was both reassuring and devastating. The trap had been well laid, but she'd seen the edges of it for months and had chosen to believe she was reading it wrong. That was the real wound. Not Celine's plan, but her own willingness to look away from it. Darius. She kept coming back to Darius the way you keep touching a bruise to check if it still hurts. She did not think he was a weak man. That had been her first instinct in the plaza, looking at his silence, and she had revised it on the walk here. A weak man couldn't have held the Western territories through 3 consecutive campaigns and built the trade expansion that had doubled the Empire's surplus in 5 years. He was not weak. He had made a choice, the same kind of choice she had watched powerful people make her entire life. The choice that said, "The cost of doing right is too high, so I will pay the smaller cost and live with the shame of it." She understood the architecture of that choice. She didn't forgive it. The formal courier came to Marin's front door at the third hour past midday. A sealed document in imperial black wax. Serafina took it from the courier without expression, broke the seal, and read the text that officially removed her Luna status, revoked her residence rights in the palace and its dependencies, and declared the bond of Alpha King Darius Veyrath dissolved pursuant to the covenant of divine alignment. At the bottom, in the space where Darius's signature sat, his hand was slightly unsteady. She could see it in the ink pressure. He'd been holding that pen hard. She folded the document and set it on the table. "Done," she said. She left the city at dusk. She took nothing from the palace. There was nothing there she wanted, and going back would have meant running Celine's gauntlet one more time with worse odds than the morning. She had the clothes on her back, a small leather pack Marin pressed on her, the contents of a private account she'd kept separate from the palace treasury for 2 years, because some part of her, the same part that cataloged traps, had understood this day was coming. The road south ran along the base of the Thornback Mountains, and she took it because it led away from the capital and toward the boundary territories where she knew the landscape and where the royal court's reach thinned with distance. She walked in the dark without a torch, her wolf senses handling the road adequately, her mind doing the work of sorting through the rubble. She was 2 hours out of the city when the sky changed. She stopped. It started in the west, the way she'd been told in childhood stories that the moon goddess's anger started. A thickening at the horizon line, a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the particular quality of silence that falls before something enormous. The stars didn't dim. They sharpened, cutting through a sky that was suddenly the wrong color. Not night black, but the deep bruised red of a fire seen through smoke. Then the first bolt came down. Not lightning. It came down white silver and hit the mountain ridge 5 miles north with a concussion she felt in her chest. The sound followed 2 seconds later. Not a crack, but a sustained resonant tone, like the largest bell ever cast being struck once and allowed to fade. Another bolt, to the east. Another, behind her, close enough that the ground shook under her boots. Serafina turned in a slow circle. In every direction, the silver light was hitting the earth. Not randomly, with precision, and between strikes and the stuttering flashes, she could see, barely, at the limit of her vision, that the sky was moving. Not clouds. Something with structure, something that arranged itself in patterns too deliberate for weather. She should have been afraid. Every rational instinct she possessed told her to be afraid. She was not afraid. Standing on that mountain road with the sky tearing itself open in every direction, she felt, and this was the piece she would not be able to explain later to anyone, she felt recognized, as though the thing happening above her was not a disaster, but a response, as though the universe had been watching that platform this morning and had made a decision. The blood red deepened across the sky until it was the only color left, until the mountains and the road and the dark countryside below were all bathed in it, and then the first temple column of silver fire went up from the direction of the capital. Then another. Then 5 more, in a line. She could hear it from here, not the sound of fire, but the sound of something older underneath the fire. A resonance that she felt in her bones, in her back teeth, in the old scar on her palm where she'd cut herself on a boundary fence at age 12, and the wound had healed wrong, leaving a crescent mark that the temple healers had once said looked, she hadn't thought about this in years, looked like a lunar sigil. The mark was warm now. She looked down at her hand. The crescent was glowing. It was faint. She might have called it a trick of the red light, might have told herself that later, but standing there in the moment, she knew it for exactly what it was. Her palm was glowing with silver-white light, the same color as the bolts hitting the ridgeline, the same color as the fire consuming the temple columns behind her, the same color as the moon on the night she was born, her mother had told her once, her mother who had been a midwife in the outer settlements. Her mother, who had never, to Serafina's knowledge, explained where the crescent scar on her daughter's palm came from, or why she'd pressed her lips together the one time Serafina asked about it, and changed the subject with a firmness that a child learns not to push past. Serafina raised her palm toward the burning sky. The light in her hand intensified. She heard, not with her ears but somewhere deeper, a word. A single syllable in a language she didn't speak, in a register too low for normal sound. It settled into her chest like a stone settling into still water and everything around it. Every question she'd been carrying, every year of silence. Every morning she'd dressed herself and gone into that palace and made herself perform belonging, reorganized around that single syllable like iron filings around a magnetic pole. Not her name. Something older than her name. A name she had been before she was Seraphina Vale, before she was Luna, before any of the identities this empire had given her or taken away. She stood on the mountain road while the sky burned and the silver fire consumed the temple columns of Nocteran, and the crescent on her palm turned the darkness around her white. And she thought, every trap has two purposes. The one the builder intends, and the one it reveals when it springs. She turned south, away from the capital in the burning sky and the empire she had just been discarded from, and she walked into the dark with her glowing hand open at her side. Behind her, the entire sky was screaming. Mashmiti. She didn't know it yet. Didn't know anything yet, standing on that road with silver light in her palm. But 3 miles ahead, cut into the base of the thornback cliffs in a section of mountain so old the Empire's survey maps had stopped bothering with it, there was a door. Not a new door, not a door anyone had built, a door that had been waiting, for someone whose blood carried a frequency the world had not heard in 400 years. It had been waiting a very long time. Tonight, for the first time since the age of the first Moon Queen, it would open. The door was not cut by human hands. She could tell that before she got close enough to touch it. The stone around it had been shaped by something that didn't bother with chisel marks or angles. It curved in on itself in a way that felt organic, like bone, like the inside of a shell. The entrance sat recessed maybe 4 feet into the cliff face, invisible from 30 yards out, visible from 10 only because the red light in the sky was hitting it at an angle that cast the recess into sharp relief. And even then, you had to be looking. Seraphina had been looking because the crescent on her palm was pulling, not metaphorically. There was a physical draw, the way a healing wound pulls toward warmth, directional and specific, leading her off the road and into the rocky slope and through a dry creek bed and up a grade of loose scree until she was standing in front of a door that the Empire had apparently spent 400 years successfully pretending did not exist. She pressed her glowing palm flat against the stone. The door opened inward without a sound. The air that came out was not cold. It was dry and very still, and it smelled of something she couldn't name. Old stone, yes, and something mineral, but underneath that a scent that hit some deep register she didn't have language for, like ozone before a strike, like the moment before something changes. She went in. The passage ran for perhaps 200 feet before it opened into a chamber large enough that she couldn't see the ceiling. Her palm provided enough light to navigate by, a fact she filed away without dwelling on, because if she started dwelling on the palm light, she was going to have to deal with everything the palm light implied, and she needed to be functional right now. The chamber walls were covered in text. Not painted. Incised. Cut into the stone with a precision that made the finest palace engravings look crude. The script ran in horizontal lines from floor to ceiling, thousands of lines, dense and continuous, in a form she didn't recognize, except she stepped closer, held her palm up. Not entirely didn't recognize. There were characters in it that appeared in the oldest surviving boundary treaty documents, the pre-imperial texts that even the palace archives held only fragments of. She'd studied those fragments. She'd had reasons to study everything the palace had. She moved along the wall with her palm raised and her eyes running the lines, looking for purchase. One word stopped her, carved larger than the surrounding text. At roughly eye level, in script she could read, Vera Sol, the name of the bloodline the royal house claimed to have descended from, the founding bloodline of the empire. But this text predated the empire. By how much, she couldn't tell yet. She kept moving along the wall. She found the second word 20 feet further, Serath Moon. She did not know that name. But her hand pulled toward it like a compass needle, the light in her palm intensifying when she laid it against those 2 carved syllables. And she stood there with her hand pressed to ancient stone and felt something in her blood answer the contact with a recognition so deep it bypassed thought entirely. Serath. Not Seraphina. something older than Serafina. She pulled her hand away and kept moving because standing still in that moment felt dangerous in a way she couldn't articulate. At the far end of the chamber, on a raised dais of black stone, there was a woman. Serafina stopped. The woman was not alive. She was not a body either. She was made of light, pale silver, the same color as the crescent on Serafina's palm, seated on the dais with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes open. The light that constituted her had the quality of something that had been waiting in exactly that position for a very long time without minding the wait. Serafina stood at the edge of the dais and stared at her for a long, careful moment. "I was told," Serafina said finally, "when I was a child, that the moon goddess appears to no one living." The light woman's mouth moved. The sound that came out of it was not loud. It was the same resonant low tone Serafina had heard outside, the single syllable that had reorganized her understanding of the evening. "You're not the goddess," Serafina said, parsing the feeling of it. "You're a recording." The light woman's expression shifted by approximately 2 degrees, something that a generous observer might call acknowledgement. "Who are you?" Serafina said. The light woman raised one hand and pointed at Serafina's chest. A silence. Then Serafina heard herself say very quietly, "That's not an answer." But even as she said it, she was looking at the walls around her, the thousands of lines of incised text, the name Sarath Moon carved at eye height, the pre-imperial script that predated everything the royal house had built its authority on. And she was already understanding that the light woman on the dais didn't need to give her an answer because the answer was already here, had been here for 4 centuries, waiting for someone whose blood carried the right frequency to walk through that door. She turned back to the walls. She read through the night. The pale gray of early morning was showing at the passage entrance when she finally sat down on the dais floor with her back against the stone and ran the full calculation. The founding story of the Noctaran Empire, as recorded in imperial texts and taught to every wolf pup in the Empire's schools, held that the alpha line of Veyrath descended from Veyra Sol, the first wolf touched by divine moonfire. The Veyrath house had carried that lineage for 400 years, using it to justify the hierarchy that placed highborn wolves above common wolves and common wolves above humans. What was cut into these walls told a different sequence. Veyra Sol had been one of 2 bloodlines touched in the founding era. The second bloodline, Sarath Moon, had been older, had been, by the text's accounting, the primary line, the one the moon goddess had chosen first. The Veyrath house had not descended from Veyra Sol through natural succession. They had taken the throne by destroying the Sarath moon line, not all at once. Over 3 generations, systematically, using methods the text described in the kind of clinical detail that made Serafina's jaw tighten as she read. Marriages engineered to dilute the bloodline. Children disappeared. Families scattered to the outer settlements and the boundary territories and stripped of any record of their lineage. The last recorded full-blood descendant of Sarath Moon had been listed as lost in the 4th generation of the Purge. That had been 412 years ago. Serafina pressed the crescent on her palm against the cold stone floor and watched the light pulse there, steady and patient. Her mother had been a midwife in the outer settlements. Her father had been a boundary wolf who died holding the eastern passes. Neither of them had ever explained the crescent scar. She thought about her mother's face when she'd asked about it. That precise quality of stillness, not evasiveness, something more controlled than that. The stillness of a woman who had made a decision years before about what she would and would not pass on, and had lived inside that decision without flinching. She thought about every year she'd spent trying to make herself worthy of a house that had spent 4 centuries making sure her bloodline couldn't exist. The light woman on the dais was still watching her. 400 years, Serafina said aloud. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. They built an empire on a lie, and then they handed me a decree saying I lacked divine sanction. She looked at her palm. Divine sanction. The light held steady. She got to her feet. She came out of the passage into a morning that was entirely the wrong temperature. Too cold, sharper than autumn should be this far south. The sky had cleared of the blood red, but the cloud formations moving in from the north had a bruised, heavy quality that experienced weather readers would have called a front. and that Serafina, standing with ancient stone at her back and a glowing hand at her side, recognized as something else. The Empire was answering. She could feel it in the ground under her boots. Not an earthquake, something more diffuse, the particular vibration of a large, complex system responding to a disruption. She'd felt similar things during the Western campaigns, the way the land changes when a major river is dammed or rerouted, everything downstream adjusting. She took the road north. She was 4 miles from the city when she encountered the first group of refugees. 12 people on the road moving south. 2 families from their appearance, the adults loaded down with as much as they could carry. 3 children too young to understand urgency walking at the pace that tired children walk. They were common wolves, boundary territory type from their dress, and they looked at Serafina with the specific expression of people who have recently seen something that recalibrated their understanding of the world. She stopped. What happened? An older man in the group, broad across the shoulders, the kind of frame that spoke to genuine physical work, looked at her clothing, processed it, recognized it as palace adjacent without recognizing her specifically. He hesitated. "The grain stores burned," he said. 3 of them, South Quarter. "From the fires last night." "From something," he said. His wife was watching Serafina with a different quality of attention. Less wary, more searching, the way people look when they're trying to place a face they've seen before. "The wells in 2 districts stopped running this morning. The water came up dry. And the soldiers—" He stopped. "What about the soldiers?" "The garrison on the eastern wall," he said. "Night watch. 12 men. Nobody can find them." Serafina held very still. 12 men don't disappear," she said. "No," the man agreed. "They don't." His wife said quietly, "You're her." The man looked sharply at his wife. "The Luna," the woman said, not breaking her gaze from Serafina's face. "From yesterday. The ceremony." The silence on the road had a weight to it. Serafina looked at the woman. She saw, in the worn lines of that face, the kind of practical intelligence that accumulates in women who have spent years watching powerful people make decisions that other people pay for. She saw wariness, and she saw something else. Something that sat alongside the wariness rather than replacing it, the way you can be afraid of a storm and still be glad it's breaking. "Yes," Serafina said. The woman nodded once, tight and deliberate. "Move your family south and keep moving," Serafina said. "Don't stop until you're past the Thornback Crossroads." "What's south of the crossroads?" the man asked. "Distance," Serafina said. "Right now, that's worth more than anything else. She walked past them and kept moving north. The capital was visible from the ridge 2 miles out, and what she saw from that distance was enough to confirm what she'd read in the chamber walls and what the refugees had started to tell her. 3 separate columns of smoke. Not the silver fire from the night before. This was ordinary burning, buildings and stores, the kind of fire that spreads from an initial disruption into the adjacent systems that were already under strain. The kind of fire that a city absorbs easily when it's healthy and cannot contain when it's already cracked. Nocturne was already cracked. She'd known that. She'd spent 7 years watching the cracks form and watching the royal house paper over them with ceremony and decree and the threat of force. The grain distribution inequity alone had been 3 years of petitions she'd submitted through proper channels. 3 years of watching Celine redirect the responses. The human settlement zones. The boundary wolf conscription rates. The way the Empire's prosperity flowed up and stopped. She'd raised those things through proper channels because she had believed then that there was a proper channel worth using, that the institution could reform itself if the right person applied sustained, patient pressure. She did not believe that anymore. She came down from the ridge and entered the city through the merchant quarter, moving with her hood up, her glowing hand shoved into her cloak pocket where the light came through the fabric as a barely perceptible warmth. Marin's shop was locked. Serafina picked the back lock with a wire she'd had in her boot since 2 years after she first moved into the palace. A small habit, a concession to the part of her brain that had always maintained a backup plan, and went through into the back room. Marin was there. She was not alone. Seated across the work table from Marin was a woman Serafina had never seen, maybe 35, with the lean, angular build of someone who covered distances on foot regularly and a scar running from her left ear to the corner of her jaw. She was dressed in Boundary Wolf traveling clothes, and she had the absolute physical stillness of someone who had been trained to sit in rooms without being noticed and had arrived early specifically to have her back to the wall. The woman looked at Serafina with eyes that were doing rapid, competent assessment. "She's exactly what I said," Marin told the woman. "She's what you described," the woman said. "That's different." Serafina came fully into the room and pushed her hood back. "Who are you?" "My name is Rael. I came from the Eastern Compact." She paused. "I've been coming for 5 weeks." "Before the ceremony?" "Before the ceremony," Rael confirmed. "What happens at the ceremony was a secondary consideration. We've been watching the Vale bloodline for 11 years. The room was very quiet for a moment. "The Eastern Compact has records," Serafina said slowly. "Boundary records that predate the Imperial Survey System." 11 generations of them, Rael said. "Your grandmother is in those records. Your mother is in those records." She looked at Serafina's right hand, which was still in her cloak pocket, still warm. "You walked into the Thornback Passage last night." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Serafina said. Rael exhaled, a controlled, measured breath, and then did something that surprised Serafina. She reached into her own coat and drew out a document case, old leather, worn smooth from long carrying, and placed it on the table between them. "Then everything the passage showed you is already yours," Rael said, "and you need to understand what you're holding before the palace figures out that passage opened." Serafina looked at the document case. Then she looked at Rael. "How long until they figure it out?" "The sensors on the old passage haven't been checked in decades. Maybe 2 days. Maybe less if Celine has resources we don't know about." Rael's jaw was set. "There's a faction in the Eastern Compact that has been building toward this for 11 years. We have assets, we have records, we have people inside the palace walls. What we don't have is the bloodline." "And you think I'm it?" "I know you're it," Rael said. "I felt the ground shift last night from 40 miles away. Every wolf in the Eastern Territories felt it. The question isn't whether you carry the Serath Moon line." She met Serafina's eyes directly. "The question is what you intend to do with it." Serafina said nothing for a long moment. She was looking at the document case. She was thinking about 12 soldiers who had been on a garrison wall and were now nowhere. She was thinking about grain stores and dry wells and families moving south with everything they could carry on their backs. She was thinking about the light woman on the dais in the chamber, pointing at her chest. She pulled her right hand out of her pocket. The crescent was still glowing, fainter in the morning light, but steady. Rael looked at it without flinching. "Show me what's in that case," Serafina said. Oats. She was still at the table 2 hours later, working through the documents, when the sound reached them from the street outside. Not shouting, something more diffuse and more ominous. The sound of a crowd in motion. The sound of several thousand people moving in the same direction with the specific quality of urgency that precedes confrontation. She went to the front window and looked out through the shutter gap. The street below was filling with common wolves. Not a parade, not an organized gathering, people pouring out of the side streets and the market square with the channeled energy of a population that had been absorbing pressure for a long time and had just been given one final piece of news. She could hear it in fragments, passed from mouth to mouth. The king's granary, sealed. No distribution today, no explanation. Marin appeared at her shoulder. "That's the 3rd district granary closed this week." Serafina watched the crowd moving. She watched the faces, the particular quality of angry people who haven't yet decided what they're angry enough to do. A threshold she recognized. She had 2 days, maybe less, before Celine found the passage. She had a faction in the Eastern Compact and a document case full of 4 centuries of buried evidence. She had a bloodline that had spent 400 years as a carefully maintained absence. And she had a kingdom that was cracking open at every seam, every suppressed fracture expressing itself simultaneously, too many pressure points at once for any amount of force to hold. She stood at the window and watched the crowd and felt the decision settle in her body before she fully articulated it in her mind. The way real decisions happen, in the gut, in the blood, in the marrow, before they become words. She had spent 7 years trying to change the empire by working within it. She was done working within it. She turned from the window. "Tell me about the people you have inside the palace walls," she said to Rael. Rael looked at her for one beat. Then she opened the document case again. "Let's start with who's been in Celine's private council," she said, "and who's been feeding us everything they say." Outside, the crowd was still moving. Inside Marin's shop, something that had been building for 4 centuries had just cleared the last threshold before impact. And in the palace 3 blocks north, behind walls that had never been breached in imperial history, Queen Mother Celine was standing at her window watching the same crowd in the street below. And her expression, for the first time since anyone who knew her could remember, carried something she had not allowed herself in 40 years of calculated power. It looked, to the one handmaid who saw it before the Queen Mother's mask settled back into place, unmistakably like fear. The document case held 11 years of someone else's courage. Serafina went through it page by page while Rael talked, and Marin kept watch at the shuttered window, and the crowd noise outside moved through its phases. The formless anger of morning, the sharper edge of midday, the particular exhausted determination of people who had decided something and were waiting for a shape to give it. The palace contacts Rael named were not names Serafina expected. 3 were servants, people she'd interacted with daily for years without understanding what they were. 2 were minor nobles from houses that had publicly supported Celine at every court session while privately feeding the Eastern Compact testimony about what those sessions actually decided. 1 was a military supply officer with access to the garrison deployment records, and 1 was a name that made her stop reading. She set the page flat on the table and looked at it. "Counselor Phelan," she said. Rael didn't look away. "He's been with us for 6 years. Phelan was Darius's personal counsel appointment. He sat in on every private strategy session for the last 4 years. She heard her own voice, very level, the register she used when she was absorbing something that needed to be absorbed carefully. "He knows everything I ever told Darius in those sessions." "Yes," Rael said, "including the Eastern Compact contacts I was building independently." A pause of maybe 2 seconds. "Yes." Serafina looked at the page a moment longer. Then she set it aside and picked up the next one, because there was nothing to do with that information except file it and keep moving. The betrayal had already happened. The only relevant question was the shape of what came next. She was 3 pages further when Rael said, "The Blood Eclipse Festival is in 4 days." Serafina set down the page she was holding. The blood eclipse happened once every 11 years. The specific alignment where the moon passed through the shadow of the earth and came out the other side visible at the horizon in the early morning, blood red, enormous, close enough that the tidal wolves in the coastal territories ran moon mad for 3 days after. It was the highest ceremonial date in the imperial calendar. Every living subject of the empire was expected to gather in their district centers. The capital plaza would hold its largest attendance of the decade, 47 noble houses. Every military commander in the empire within traveling distance, common wolves from every district, and a ceremony platform 40 feet above the plaza that could be seen from every sightline in the capital. She looked at Rael. "You were already planning to use it," Serafina said. "We were planning to use it without the bloodline," Rael said. "With documentation alone. Public disclosure of the imperial records we've built over 11 years. She paused. "With the bloodline, it's a different calculation." "It's a different century," Marin said quietly from the window. "Not." They worked through the afternoon. The plan had a structure Serafina recognized. It had the shape of something built by careful people over a long time, with redundancies and fallback positions, and the kind of operational patience that only develops in people who have been doing something dangerous for years without the luxury of urgency. She revised it in 3 places where the palace's internal geography had changed since the Eastern Compact's last confirmed update, and in 2 more places where she knew things about Celine's personal routines that no outside observer would have been positioned to know. By evening, they had something that was not perfect. Nothing with this many variables could be, but was solid in the places that mattered most. She was rolling up the main document when her hand stopped. The crescent on her palm had gone cold. She looked down at it. The light was gone. The mark sat on her skin the way it had always sat, raised, pale, a healed wrong scar, without any illumination at all. She didn't say anything about it. She finished rolling the document and tied it. Outside, the crowd noise had finally died down. Night had come. The city had a held breath quality, the specific silence that follows a day of high tension when nothing has yet broken and everything is still possible. She slept on the floor of Marin's back room for 4 hours and woke with the particular clarity of someone whose mind had been working through the night on problems she hadn't consciously assigned it. She lay still in the dark and thought, the crescent going cold is information. What information? She didn't have an answer yet. She filed it and got up. The next 3 days had a texture she would remember later as compressed, not fast exactly, but dense, each hour carrying the weight of several. Rael moved through the city using routes that Serafina quickly understood had been established and maintained over years. Messages went to the Eastern Compact. Responses came back through intermediaries in the merchant quarter and the boundary settlement on the city's south edge. The palace contacts activated quietly. 2 of them went silent on the second day. Serafina noted it and adjusted the plan's architecture around the gaps, without letting herself speculate too hard about what the silence meant for the people involved. On the morning of the 3rd day, she found a fragment of evidence she hadn't been looking for. She'd been working through the older documents in Rael's case, the lineage records, the generational tracking, and she hit a notation in a boundary territory census from 12 years back, a notation she recognized the handwriting of. Phelan. Counselor Phelan had been in the boundary territories 12 years ago. The notation was a population count, routine on its face, but the column he'd added to the standard form, a column that wasn't part of the official census format, tracked bloodline indicators, crescent marks, unusual healing rates, moon sensitivity in offspring, 12 years ago. 4 years before Rael said he'd come to the Eastern Compact. She sat with that for a long time. Phelan hadn't come to the Eastern Compact. He'd been placed there. The Eastern Compact thought they'd recruited a disaffected palace insider. What they'd actually done was absorb a long-term intelligence asset. She looked at the plan laid out on the table in front of her. She looked at every place Phelan's information had shaped it. Then she got up and went to find Rael. The conversation was brief and very hard. Rael sat across from her and listened without interrupting, and when Serafina finished laying out what she'd found, there was a silence that had a different quality from the operational silences they'd been working in. This one had the specific weight of a person reconfiguring something fundamental about their understanding of the last 6 years. How much did he know? Rael said finally. Everything you told him, which means everything he told you that shaped your operational picture. I have to assume that's compromised. Serafina kept her voice flat. The palace contacts who went silent 2 days ago. Rael's jaw tightened. Celine. She's known something was coming for at least as long as Phelan's been feeding her. She may have known the full framework. Then why hasn't she moved on us already? Because she doesn't want to move on us quietly, Serafina said. She wants the festival, the same platform we want, the same audience, the same ceremonial weight. She wants to make an example publicly. The silence again. She's going to let us come, Rael said. She's been building the trap we plan to walk into, Serafina said. She needs the evidence we're carrying to disappear publicly. Discredited, not just suppressed. And she needs me discredited or dead in front of every house and commander in the empire. Rael looked at her steadily. So we don't go. Serafina said nothing. We take the documents south. The Eastern Compact has territory and resources. We build from outside. In another decade, Serafina said, while the granaries stay sealed, while the garrison soldiers keep disappearing, while the common wolves in this city spend another 10 years being told the hierarchy is divinely sanctioned. She looked at the table. We had 2 days and now we have 1. The festival is tomorrow. You want to walk into her trap. I want to walk into it differently than she's built it for. What? She went back to the passage that night alone. She went because the crescent had gone cold, and she needed to understand why, and because there was no one else she could ask. Rael had 11 years of operational intelligence and a genuine commitment and a judgment Serafina had come to respect. But what Serafina needed tonight wasn't tactical. The passage opened when she pressed her palm to the stone, same as before, but the light in her hand was thin, strained. She walked in with less illumination than the first time and found the chamber by memory. The light woman on the dais was dimmer too. Serafina stood at the edge of the dais and looked at her. "I've been trying," she said. It came out rougher than she intended. "I've been trying to do this the way you'd want it done. Build a case, find allies, use the evidence, go through the festival with a plan that minimizes destruction." She stopped. "She's turned the whole thing around. She's going to use it to end everything I've built and everything the Eastern Compact has built. And if I push forward, I'm walking 40 people into a kill zone." The light woman was very still. "The passage gave me something," Serafina said. "I felt it. I felt it in the thornback, and I felt it on the road, and I haven't felt it since I started planning." She looked at her hand. "The crescent went cold the moment I started treating this like a military operation." The light woman raised one hand and held it palm out. Serafina looked at her own palm. The mark was still dark. "I don't know what you're asking me to do," Serafina said. Her voice was very quiet now, stripped of the operational control she'd been maintaining. "I know what the documents say I am. I know what my blood says I am. But knowing it in a document and knowing it in your body are two different things, and I don't—" She stopped. "I don't know how to become what I apparently already am." The light woman lowered her hand. She did something she hadn't done before. She stood up from the dais. She walked towards Serafina and stopped 1 foot away and looked at her with those pale light eyes, and she reached out and pressed 2 fingers against the center of Serafina's chest, above her sternum, and left them there. The cold in Serafina's palm went from absence to negative. A deep, aching cold that was not temperature but something structural, something that felt like the space before a fracture when the material has been stressed past its design tolerance. She felt it spread from her chest outward, down her arms, up her throat. She did not step back. She stood there and let it happen, because every instinct she'd honed over 7 years of surviving a hostile palace told her that this was the threshold, and the only thing worse than crossing it was stopping short. The cold reached her hand and reversed. The warmth that came back was not the same warmth. The first time the crescent had lit, it had felt like recognition, like a frequency match, like tuning forks. What came back now felt older and less comfortable and considerably less like recognition and considerably more like a command. The light woman stepped back. Serafina looked at her own hand. The crescent was burning white, brighter than either previous time, bright enough that she had to look away from it. She understood, standing there in that chamber with her hand on fire and the ancient text surrounding her in every direction, that there was no version of tomorrow where she managed this carefully. There was no operational architecture that threaded the needle Celine had built. Rael's plan, her revised version of it, had been built on the premise that she was a woman with a bloodline and a document case and a faction behind her. That wasn't what she was. She hadn't been ready to know what she was until this moment, in this chamber, with the light woman's 2 fingers having pressed that knowledge directly into her sternum. She walked out of the passage. Heat. She found Rael awake when she returned, which she'd expected. Rael was the kind of person who didn't sleep before an operation. "Change of plan," Serafina said. Rael looked at her face, then at her hand, which was still warm, though the visible light had faded. "How much change?" "The document presentation stays. The Eastern Compact contacts stay. The Palace Asset Network stays." She sat down. "What changes is what walks onto that platform tomorrow." Rael was quiet for a moment. "And what walks onto that platform?" "Not a woman with evidence." Serafina looked at her. "Something that doesn't need to make a legal argument." The silence that followed had a different quality from all the silences before. Rael was not a person who was easily unsettled. 11 years of dangerous work had filed that quality down to almost nothing. But she was looking at Serafina now with an expression that sat precisely between the focused attention of a tactical mind processing a new variable and the older, less trained response of someone in the presence of something that exceeds their framework. "When we walk in tomorrow," Rael said carefully, "what am I walking in beside?" Serafina held her gaze for a long time. "Something Celine has never faced," she said. "Because the last time it existed, she wasn't born yet. Outside, the city was quiet. Tomorrow was the Blood Eclipse Festival. The Empire would gather. And for the first time in 400 years, the thing that had been buried was going to stand in front of the people who buried it and speak in a language that no legal decree, no ceremonial precedent, and no amount of carefully maintained fear had ever been designed to answer. Celine's trap was built for a woman. What was coming was not a woman anymore. Not entirely. The blood eclipse began before dawn. The moon was still high when it started, that gradual darkening at the edge, the Earth's shadow moving across the surface with the particular patience of astronomical events that do not hurry for anyone. By the time the capital's first bells rang for gathering, the moon had gone the color of old iron. And by the time Serafina crossed the merchant quarter on foot, with Rael 2 steps behind her and 4 Eastern Compact operatives spread through the crowd ahead, it was the color of a wound. The plaza was already packed, 18,000 at minimum. She could see it from the approach road, the density of bodies filling every sight line, vendors and common wolves and noble retinues pressing against each other in the shadow of the palace walls. Every garrison post she could identify was doubled. Celine had moved soldiers into positions that looked ceremonial and were not. Serafina counted placements as she walked and felt Rael doing the same behind her without looking. 16 additional posts, Rael said quietly. 18, Serafina said. 2 are in the gallery tiers dressed as house retinues. She kept walking. The crescent on her palm had been burning since she woke up. Not the thin, uncertain warmth of the previous days, something consistent and deep, like a coal that had finally reached its working temperature. She kept her hand in her cloak, but she could feel it against the fabric, and she had stopped trying to moderate it. It was going to do what it was going to do. She thought about what Rael had asked her last night. What am I walking in beside? She thought about her own answer, something Celine has never faced. She thought, I hope that's true. Because if I'm wrong about what I am, today ends in about 4 minutes. She pushed through the edge of the crowd and kept moving toward the platform. Darius was already on the platform when she came through the access corridor. She came up through the interior passage that she knew from 7 years of ceremonial preparation, the route the palace staff used, which the doubled garrison had not thought to fully seal because they were watching the public approaches. She came out into the preparation chamber beneath the platform, and she heard his voice through the floor above her before she saw him. He was talking to someone. His voice had the clipped, tight quality of a man managing something that was not going the way he'd planned it. She went up the stairs. He turned when he heard her boots on the top step, and she watched the sequence of responses move through his face. First the sheer involuntary shock of her presence, then something that might have been relief and might have been dread, and then finally the settling into a hardness that she recognized as the face he used when he decided something and didn't want it examined. The person he'd been talking to was Phelan. Phelan looked at her with the expression of a man running calculations. Serafina looked back at him with no expression at all. Get off this platform, she said to Phelan. Phelan looked at Darius. I said get off it, Serafina said. You're done being the thing in the room that nobody names. Walk away, or I name you right now in front of the 18,000 people standing 40 feet below us. A silence of maybe 3 seconds. Phelan walked to the stairs and went down them. Darius watched her. His jaw was working slightly, the tell she'd learned in the 2nd year of their bond. The thing he did when he was holding back words that wanted to come out badly. He was in full ceremonial armor, same as the last ceremony, same black iron and hammered silver, and he looked like a man who had put on the armor because the armor was the only thing he was sure of anymore. You shouldn't be here, he said. I live here, she said. That's actually the core of the problem. Serafina, how long did you know? She kept her voice level. Not an accusation, she genuinely wanted the information. About the passage, about my bloodline. He was quiet for long enough that she had her answer. Celine told you before the ceremony, she said. That's why she was able to use the divine sanction framing. She knew I'd go south. She knew I'd find the passage, and she needed the ceremony to happen before I did. She told me there were records, Darius said carefully. Old records. She said the Serath bloodline was a destabilizing force, that the Empire couldn't survive. She told you a story that made it easier to stand still, Serafina said. And you decided it was true because it was convenient. His face tightened. You let her strip me in front of your empire, Serafina said. Not because you believed her, because believing her was easier than the alternative. She watched him absorb that. I'm not here to argue about it. I'm past arguing about it. I'm here because what happens in the next hour affects every living person in that plaza, and I'd rather you were part of the right side of it than not. What are you planning? Justice, she said, which is different from what your mother is planning. Sot. Below, the ceremony was starting. She could hear Voron's amplified voice beginning the blood eclipse ritual, the formal words that opened the decade's most significant ceremonial gathering. The crowd had gone into the particular quiet of assembled thousands waiting for something significant to be said. She moved to the platform edge and looked down. She found Celine immediately. The Queen Mother was standing at the ceremony basin, white-dressed, silver-haired, with the absolute composed authority of a woman who believed every piece of her trap was in position. She was 3 feet from the lunar fire basin, and positioned on her left was a figure Serafina hadn't expected. Liliane. The human woman was pale and stood with a stillness that read less like composure and more like someone who had been placed in a position they hadn't chosen and didn't entirely understand. She was dressed simply. No silver today, just pale cream. And she was watching the crowd with eyes that tracked differently from Celine's. Not calculating. Something closer to frightened. Serafina looked at Liliane for a long moment and felt something she hadn't made room for in the 3 days of operational planning. Liliane was 22 years old. She had been brought to a foreign empire by a powerful woman and placed into the center of a succession crisis that she had not designed and very likely did not fully comprehend. Whatever she was to Darius, whatever had happened or not happened in those 5 months, she was not the author of this. Celine was the author of this. Serafina turned back to Darius. When this starts, stay out of the way. Serafina, I mean it. Whatever you feel about your mother, whatever you feel about any of it, stay out of the way until it's over. But she looked at him directly. If you try to stop what's coming, you'll be in the path of it. I can't protect you from that. His jaw was tight. And if I try to help you, then help me by not making it worse. She paused. You're good at staying silent. Do it one more time. She walked to the platform stairs. Again, she came out onto the platform while Voron was mid-sentence. The old arbiter stopped. 47 noble houses in the gallery tiers turned. 18,000 wolves in the plaza below craned upward, and the murmur that ran through the crowd had the specific texture of a sound that had been waiting to be made. Celine turned. Her expression did not change. It was a very precise kind of not changing. The face of a woman who had prepared for exactly this and was now executing the prepared response. She turned to the garrison captain on her right and made one small, controlled gesture. 6 soldiers moved onto the platform from the side entries. Serafina didn't stop walking. She walked to the center of the platform, to the space between Voron and the lunar fire basin, and she turned to face the plaza below. 18,000 faces. She raised her right hand. The crescent was no longer warm. It was incandescent, white silver, the same light as the ancient passage, the same light as the thornback bolts, the same light that had been buried for 4 centuries under carefully maintained lies. It lit her face from below, and it lit the platform, and it caught in the surface of the lunar fire basin, and the 2 lights, the earthly fire and the ancient bloodline light, merged into something that had never been seen in this empire in living memory. The crowd went absolutely silent. The 6 soldiers stopped moving. Celine's face, for one fraction of a second, showed the thing her handmaid had seen 3 days ago. Serafina opened her mouth and spoke, and the amplification architecture of the platform carried her voice across the plaza with the same clarity it had always carried the words of people who were supposed to stand here. "My name," she said, "is Seraphina of the Serath Moon Line, the last of a bloodline your empire spent 400 years erasing." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "I have documentation. You'll see it. But first you need to understand why it was hidden." From the gallery tiers, she could see the Eastern Compact operatives beginning to move, documents changing hands, the evidence packet being distributed through the noble sections with the efficiency of 11 years of planning. She'd run this piece even knowing the operational compromise because the documents didn't need to be a surprise. They just needed to exist publicly. "The founding covenant of this empire was built on a theft," she said. "The Veyrath house did not inherit divine authority. They took it. From a bloodline they spent 3 generations destroying. Everything your hierarchy rests on. Every law that says a highborn wolf is worth more than a common wolf. Every decree that puts humans at the bottom of a structure that was never divinely ordered. It's built on a crime that the evidence in your hands right now has preserved in detail." Noise from the gallery tiers now. Not the crowd murmur, but the specific sound of nobles receiving information they had not prepared for. Celine stepped forward. Her voice came through clearly, controlled and cold. "This woman was stripped of her Luna status by lawful decree. She has no standing." "The decree cites divine sanction," Seraphina said, not looking at Celine, addressing the plaza. "The same divine authority whose actual source is in the documents you're holding. When the house that wrote the decree is itself the crime the decree is designed to cover," she paused, "the decree has no foundation to stand on." A sound from the crowd, unlike anything she'd heard in 7 years of public ceremony. Not anger, not celebration. Something that had more in common with the sound a structure makes when a load-bearing element is removed. Celine made a second gesture to the garrison captain. More soldiers moved. Not 6, 20. Botran. They came from 3 directions simultaneously, and Seraphina felt rather than heard Rael's response from the crowd below. 3 sharp sounds in rapid sequence that were not weapons discharging, but were the signal pattern she and Rael had established, telling her, "We see it. We're moving. Hold." She held. The 20 soldiers spread across the platform and she tracked them without moving, calculating the pattern, understanding in the space of 4 seconds that Celine had not sent them to arrest her. The positioning was wrong for arrest. 2 soldiers had moved to Liliane's position on the left. 2 more had moved to the stairwell that Darius would have to use to reach the platform floor. Not arrest. Containment. Every variable contained, all at once. And then Celine moved. She moved to Liliane, and the motion was so fast and so decisive and so absolutely without hesitation that it had happened before anyone on the platform had fully processed it as intentional. Liliane made a sound, one sharp, involuntary sound, and then she was on the ground. The plaza erupted. Not the structured roar of a crowd responding to ceremony. Something rawer, more primal. The sound of 18,000 wolves who had just watched a woman fall and couldn't yet determine what they'd witnessed, but whose bodies had already responded before their minds caught up. Seraphina was moving. She crossed the platform in 4 strides and reached Liliane and dropped to one knee, and the woman was alive. Barely, her breath coming in the shallow, panicked rhythm of someone in shock, her hand pressing against her side where Celine's ring blade had opened a thin, deep line. Not a mortal wound, not yet. But Liliane's eyes were open and they found Seraphina's face, and she said, with the specific urgency of someone who knew they were running a narrow window, "She told me, 2 weeks ago. She told me everything she'd done." Her breath hitched. "She needed me to say I chose it, that I came here freely. She needed my testimony to hold." The pressure on her side was turning her fingers dark. "I wouldn't." Seraphina held the woman's gaze steady and kept her own face from doing the thing it wanted to do. "I'm going to make sure you get off this platform," Seraphina said. "Look at me. I'm going to make sure of that." "She planned the whole ceremony," Liliane said. "Your removal, the betrothal, all of it. She told Darius there would be no violence if he—" A pause, a hard swallow. "She said she just needed a clean political transition. She lied to him too. Serafina looked up. Selena was standing 10 feet away. The ring blade was gone, folded back into the wrist piece, invisible, exactly as it had been before anyone noticed it. Her expression had the terrible composure of someone who had already decided what the story was going to be. "The Sarath girl attacked my ward," Celine said. Her voice was clean and carried. "Unprovoked, before witnesses." The platform soldiers were arrayed between Celine and Serafina, 20 men, and every one of them had spent their careers understanding what their loyalty was worth. Most would hold, some would not. Serafina didn't have time to calculate which was which. She heard boots on the platform stairs. Darius. He came up fast. Not the controlled pace of ceremony, but a dead run. And he came out onto the platform and took in the scene in the space of 1 second, and she watched the calculation move through him faster than she'd ever seen him think. He looked at Liliane on the ground. He looked at his mother. He looked at Serafina. Celine said, "Darius." His name in her mouth, that specific note of command his mother had been using since he was old enough to hear it. The note that said, "This is the moment you choose me, the way you have always chosen me." He looked at Serafina. She was on one knee with her glowing hand pressed against Liliane's side. And the light was doing something neither she nor anyone else had planned for, the crescent's warmth bleeding into the wound, slowing it in a way that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with what she apparently carried in her blood. He looked at his mother. Something moved through his face, not the erasure she'd catalogued in the months before the ceremony, not the guilt she'd seen at the ceremony itself. Something older than either of those. Something that looked like a man arriving at the question he should have asked years ago, and finding that the answer had been obvious the entire time, and had cost everyone around him dearly for the duration of his willingness to not look at it. "Stand down," he said to the soldiers. Celine's composure fractured by exactly 1 degree. "Darius, stand them down," he said. Louder, to the garrison captain specifically. "That's an order." The soldiers looked at the captain. The captain looked at the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother looked at Darius, and the look she gave him had the quality of a final offer. The last moment before something between them that had been maintained for 30 years, at considerable cost to everyone in its vicinity, finally, irrevocably closed. He held her gaze. He did not look away. The soldiers stepped back. The crowd below was a wall of sound. Not chaos, not yet, but the specific noise of 18,000 people on the absolute edge of it, held in place by the sheer physical tension of what was happening on the platform 40 feet above them. Celine looked at her son for 3 more seconds. Then she said, very quietly, "You have no idea what you've just done." And she turned, not fled, not retreated, walked with the absolute precision of a woman who is changing tactics rather than conceding, and went to the far end of the platform where the guard post stood, and the soldier there looked at her and she said 2 words too quietly to carry. The soldier's expression changed. Serafina was on her feet. Because she recognized those 2 words even without hearing them, recognized them by their effect on the soldier's face and posture and the specific way his hand moved to the signal horn at his belt. She'd spent 7 years watching Celine operate in rooms, and she knew the Queen Mother's last option gesture, the way you know the sound of a building starting to go. "Rael!" she shouted. Below, in the crowd, things began to move. And on the platform, the Queen Mother reached the guard post and turned back to face the plaza. And her face had changed completely, the human mask gone, something underneath it that Serafina had suspected existed but had never seen. And her form was beginning to shift, the silver hair and white dress and 53 years of careful human performance dissolving into something that the soldiers around her were scrambling backward from, something that the 47 noble houses in the gallery tiers were rising to their feet to see, something that the last generation of imperial wolves had only ever heard described in the kind of stories you tell to explain why certain things should never be released. Darius was beside her now, close enough that she felt him rather than saw him, and she heard him say, not to her, to himself, in a voice stripped of everything except the plain truth of a man seeing something he'd been protected from seeing his entire life. "She never let me see it." "No," Serafina said. "She wouldn't." The thing that had been Selene opened its mouth, and the sound that came out of it hit the plaza like a physical impact, and Serafina felt the moonfire in her blood rise in response, not in fear, not in retreat, in opposition, the way two forces of equivalent magnitude meet each other at the point of collision. Not fear, not anymore. Darius put his hand on her arm and she looked at him and he said, "Tell me how to help." She looked at the thing on the platform. She looked at the crescent burning on her palm. She looked at 18,000 people below who had nowhere to run and a fight about to come down on them from 40 feet above. She thought, this is what it costs. This specific moment, this specific weight. The price of being the last of something. She had been trying to carry it carefully for 3 days. Careful was done. "Get Liliane off this platform," she said to Darius. "Get her off and get yourself clear." "I'm not leaving." "Darius." She met his eyes, and she made sure he understood, in the way you can make someone understand a thing without words when you know them well enough and have run out of time for anything softer. "I need you clear. I need to be able to do this without watching your back at the same time." His hand tightened on her arm. "Let go." He moved to Liliane. Serafina turned to face the thing that had been Selene. The crescent was burning so bright now it cast shadows on the platform floor behind her. Hard, sharp shadows. The kind you get from a light source that doesn't flicker. The lunar fire in the basin had gone from pale white blue to the same color as her hand. The two sources merging into something the platform architecture had not been designed to contain. The plaza below had gone completely silent. All of it. All 18,000. Every voice, every movement, every sound. Watching. The thing on the platform took its first step toward her. Serafina held her ground. She had been erased, documented, discredited, stripped, framed, and reduced to a liability to be managed by a house that had built its empire on a murder no one was supposed to remember. She had spent 7 years being carefully dismantled by someone who understood that the most effective erasure is the kind you make the target participate in. She was done participating. She raised her palm toward the thing crossing the platform, and she pulled, not from training, not from strategy, from something that lived below both of those, in the same place the crescent had always lived, the place that had been waiting longer than she'd been alive. And the light answered. The platform shook. The sky above the Capitol tore open, and for the first time in 400 years the Empire looked up. The thing that had been Selene hit the platform like a collapsed wall. Not a collision, a pressure event, the kind that moves through a space and reorganizes everything inside it. The soldiers who hadn't already fled were down on the stone, not dead, flattened by the shockwave of two forces meeting at a scale the platform had not been built to host. The lunar fire basin had shattered. Pale fragments of carved stone were scattered across 40 feet of platform floor, and the fire that had been contained in it was now burning freely in a ring around the center of the platform, white silver, fed by something that had nothing to do with the oil in the basin's reservoir. Serafina was in the center of it. She was on her knees. She didn't remember going to her knees. At some point in the last 3 minutes, she had stopped registering her body's status with any precision, because her body had become secondary to the thing moving through it. The ancient frequency of the Seraph moonline running at a volume she had not known she was capable of producing, burning through her like current through a wire that was too thin for the load. Her right arm from the elbow down was numb. Her vision had gone white at the edges. She could feel her heartbeat in her back teeth. The thing that had been Selene was 30 feet away and circling. It was large. That was the first thing you understood about it. The thing that overrode every other piece of information your senses were trying to send you. The silver wolf form it had settled into was not natural. It was too dense, too deliberate, carrying the distilled weight of 4 centuries of stolen bloodline power that Selene had accumulated through methods Serafina now understood from the passage walls and preferred not to think about in detail. Its eyes were not wolf eyes. They were the eyes of the thing behind the wolf, old and cold and entirely without the confusion of an animal. It knew exactly what it was doing. It was waiting for her to run out. Serafina pressed her numb right hand flat against the platform stone and felt the contact. Stone, old stone, the same materials that made the passage walls, the same empire that had been built on the ruins of what she came from. And she used that contact to anchor herself against the white at the edges of her vision, and she breathed. She had been trying to win this fight. That had been the wrong frame. This was not a fight to win, it was a fire to contain, and the difference between those two things was everything. You fight with force, you contain with position, with patience, with the willingness to take the hit rather than deflect it and let it destroy something behind you. She changed what she was doing. She stopped pushing the frequency outward and let it run downward, into the stone, into the old foundation, into the same bedrock the passage was cut from. And the effect was immediate. The white at her vision edges cleared. The numbness in her arm retreated from the shoulder down to the elbow. The shaking in her knees steadied. The thing circling her felt the change. It stopped. For one held second, the platform was completely still. And in that stillness, Serafina heard, from the plaza below, from 18,000 people who had been watching in absolute silence, a sound that was not a roar and not a cheer. Something more human than either. The involuntary sound of a large group of people exhaling at the same moment, releasing a breath they had not known they were holding. They were still there. They were watching. She got to her feet. But the thing charged. It came fast and low, the way predators move when they've decided the approach is done. And Serafina stood her ground until the last possible second, and then she did not dodge. She dropped her right palm to the platform stone, crescent down, and pulled. The stone lit up. Not just around her. In a line from her palm outward, racing across the platform floor in every direction, the silver-white frequency traveled through the material of the platform itself, through foundation stone that had been quarried from the same mountain range as the passage, through material that carried the same mineral signature, that the crescent on her palm apparently read as continuous with the passage's ancient structure. The light ran along every crack and joint in the platform's surface and hit the approaching form like a wave coming from every direction simultaneously. The thing that had been Celine stopped as though it had walked into a wall that didn't exist in physical space. It stood there. It was breathing. Enormous, ragged pulls of air, and its form was flickering. The stolen power it had been running was expensive. Serafina could see that now, could read it the way you learn to read structural stress in a building that's been loaded past its tolerance. The distortion at the edges of the form, the eyes losing their cold focus, and then recovering it, and then losing it again. 4 centuries of accumulated power, a genuine store. But it had been built through extraction, through stealing and storing and never producing anything of its own, an extraction. Serafina understood this in her blood, if not in words, understood it the way the passage walls had understood it when they cut the history of the Veyrath house into stone. Extraction has a different structure than source. You can fill a vessel by drawing from other vessels. But when you meet something that goes to the source directly, the vessel's contents are finite and the source is not. She walked toward it, step by deliberate step, with her right palm still lit, with her feet on stone that was still running her frequency outward in every direction. "It's over," she said. The thing looked at her with Celine's eyes, her real eyes, the ones underneath the wolf form, the ones that had been watching Serafina from across rooms for 7 years with the specific attention of someone managing a problem. Even now, even in this form, even with the power flickering, those eyes had their particular quality of calculation. "You don't have the will to finish it," Celine said. Her voice came out distorted, too large for the form it was coming from. "You've spent 7 years trying to reform things, trying to make systems better. You don't have the specific quality of ruthlessness." "No," Serafina said. She stopped 6 feet away. "I don't." Celine's form stabilized slightly, reading the concession as an opening. "What I have," Serafina said, "is the authority to judge, which is different from the authority to destroy." She held the cold gaze. "And I'm exercising it." She placed both hands flat on the platform stone. What moved through the stone after that was not a weapon. Serafina would spend a long time afterward trying to find a language for it and arrive at unsatisfying approximations. It was the frequency of the source, the original covenant between the Seraph Moon line and the force that had touched it in the founding era, applied not as force, but as assessment, as exposure. The way light in a room doesn't destroy the darkness, it simply makes the room's contents visible. What it revealed was everything Celine had built and everything she had used to build it, and the specific cost of each piece of it to the people it had been taken from. It revealed it to the platform, to the stone, to the air, to the 18,000 people in the plaza below who felt it pass through them like a cold wind and understood, not in words, in something more direct than words, the shape of what they had been living inside. The thing that had been Celine made a sound, not rage, not defiance, the specific sound of something that has been exposed completely and has nothing left to put between itself and that exposure. The form collapsed inward. What remained on the platform floor in the silver-white light was a woman, 53 years old, silver hair loose and tangled, the white ceremonial dress torn at the shoulder, her hands flat on the stone holding herself up, and her breathing the ragged, spent breathing of someone who has run out of everything. She looked up at Serafina, and Serafina, looking down at her, felt something she had not anticipated feeling. Not triumph, not satisfaction, something quieter and harder. The feeling of standing at the far side of a thing that cost more than you'd budgeted for, and looking back at the distance covered and understanding that you are changed by it in ways you haven't fully inventoried yet. She had come here to judge. She had not come here to hate. "You built an empire," Serafina said. Her voice had come back to its normal register, not amplified, just carrying in the silence of the platform. And the only way you could hold it was to spend every year of your life making sure the truth about how it was built never surfaced. That's not strength. She looked at the woman on the stone. That's a cage. You built yourself a cage, and you called it a throne. Celine said nothing. "I strip you of it," Serafina said. "All of it. Every title, every claim, every instrument of the power you've been using to maintain the lie. I strip it under the authority of what I carry and what you've spent 4 centuries trying to erase." She held the older woman's gaze. "And I leave you with your life, because that's the difference between what you built and what I'm going to build." She stepped back. Celine remained on the stone. Darius found her at the platform's edge 20 minutes later. The plaza had not erupted into chaos, which had been Serafina's specific fear for 4 days, and which the reality of the moment had apparently overridden. 18,000 wolves who had watched what they had watched were doing what people do after exposure to something that reorganizes their understanding of the world. Standing still, talking quietly to the people beside them, sitting down on the plaza stones because standing required more certainty than they currently possessed. Liliane was being tended to by 2 Eastern compact medics Rael had positioned in the crowd. Her wound was not mortal. The crescent warmth had done more work on it than any of them would be able to fully explain, and the medics were working around that fact with the pragmatic professionalism of people who had decided to simply be grateful. Darius came to stand beside her at the platform's edge, and they stood there looking down at the plaza together in a silence that had a different texture from the silences before. Not strained, not managed. The silence of 2 people who have run out of the things they were using to avoid what needs to be said. His armor had a crack along the left shoulder plate from something that had hit the platform during the fight. There was blood on his jaw from a cut she couldn't see the source of. He looked, standing there, like a man who had spent 30 years being one thing and was standing at the beginning of the long project of figuring out what came next. "I knew before the ceremony," he said, "about the bloodline. Not the full history. Not what was in the passage. She told me enough to make me afraid." He kept his gaze on the plaza. "I told myself I was protecting the empire, protecting stability. That one person's claim wasn't worth the disruption." Serafina listened. "I was protecting myself," he said, "from the weight of it, from the choice." He paused. "I've been protecting myself from choices for a long time. My mother made it easy. She was always there to make the hard calls so I didn't have to." "I know," Serafina said. "I failed you." He said it plainly, without the elaborate architecture of qualification she might have expected. 7 years of building something real, and when the moment came I stood still. There's no construction I can put on that. She looked at him. The morning light was full now, the blood eclipse past its peak, the moon moving back toward its ordinary color on the horizon. He met her gaze and didn't look away, and she saw in his face the thing she'd stopped expecting to see months ago. Not the erasure, not the guilt, just the plain, undefended face of a man trying to look at a true thing. I know, she said again. Is there... He stopped, tried again. I'm not asking for what was there before. I understand that's gone. His voice was careful with it, like a man handling something fragile that he knows he has no right to handle carelessly. I'm asking if there's anything that can be built from what's left. Serafina looked out at the plaza for a long time. Not today, she said. Not soon. She felt the words finding their true weight as she said them. But you stood down the garrison. You moved to Liliane. When it mattered, you made the right choice, and it cost you something real. She turned to face him fully. That's what I have to work with, not what we were. What you just proved you're capable of being. He held her gaze. I serve beside, he said, not above. I understand that. Yes, she said. You do now. What? She found Liliane in the preparation chamber below, sitting upright against the wall with a bandage at her side and the particular pale, clear-eyed expression of someone who has been close to a threshold and come back from it. Liliane looked up when Serafina came in. She didn't look away. I didn't choose this, Liliane said. Coming here. I want that understood. It is understood, Serafina said. She sat down against the opposite wall, because her legs had decided they were going to have an opinion about the last several hours. She recruited you. My family has debt to the Imperial Treasury. She made an offer. I was told it was a formal alliance arrangement, a diplomatic placement. I didn't understand what it was until I was here, and it was too late to leave without consequences. A flat pause. She's very good at building situations where the only exits lead somewhere worse. Yes, Serafina said. She is. The two women sat in the chamber's quiet for a moment. Above them, through the stone ceiling, they could hear the murmur of the plaza beginning its slow reconstruction. People moving, voices rising, the particular sound of a large group beginning the long work of deciding what to do with the truth they had just been handed. What happens to me now? Liliane said. That depends on what you want, Serafina said. You can go home. Your family's debt to the treasury is cleared. I'll put that in the first decrees. You can stay if you want to be part of what gets built here. She looked at the young woman directly. But I want you to know that you are not a footnote in this. What you didn't do, what you refused to provide Celine, held. That mattered. The history of this day will say that. Liliane was quiet for a long moment. I'd like to go home, she said, for a while. Then you go home, Serafina said. She stood in the center of the plaza at midday, not on the platform. On the plaza floor, the same stone that 18,000 ordinary wolves and humans and boundary territory people were standing on. She had asked for no ceremony, no formal staging. She had asked only that the people who wanted to hear what came next stay close. Most of the 18,000 stayed. She looked at them, the faces she'd been watching from 40 feet above for 7 years, the ones she'd petitioned for and written decrees for and been unable to fully reach across the distance that the platform imposed, and she felt the full weight of what she was holding. Not power, responsibility. Those two things had been conflated in the Nocturne Empire for 4 centuries, and she understood standing there that the entire project of what came next was going to require keeping them rigorously separate. The hierarchy that organized this empire is abolished, she said. Today. Not by degree, not by transition period. Today. The classification of wolves by bloodline, the subordination of humans by species, it's done. The legal architecture of it will take time to dismantle. That work begins tomorrow. She paused. The granaries open this afternoon. All of them. A sound from the crowd. Not celebration. Something more worn and more real. The sound of people for whom the opening of granaries was not an abstraction. I will not tell you the new order is perfect, she said. I will not tell you I know how to build it correctly. What I can tell you is that every decision made from this platform going forward will be made with the full record visible, who it affects, what it costs, whose life it changes. No more governance from behind walls that only some people are allowed to stand behind. She looked out at the crowd. I'm asking you to build something with me, she said. Not for me, with me. There's a difference, and I intend to maintain it. Tot. 3 months later, Serafina walked the boundary territories on foot. She did this regularly now. Had established it in the first week as a practice she refused to drop regardless of what the council's schedule demanded. She walked the outer settlements and the human compact zones and the places where the old empire's hierarchy had expressed itself most concretely in the physical conditions of people's lives. And she looked at those conditions with her own eyes, rather than through report documents. And she let what she saw inform the decisions that were piling up on her council table every morning. It was slower than she'd expected. It was also more possible than she'd expected, which she hadn't let herself predict because predicting possibility felt, after the years she'd had, like a vulnerability she couldn't afford. She was learning to afford it. Rael had taken a council position, which she'd initially resisted and eventually accepted on the grounds that 11 years of operational intelligence inside an authoritarian empire constituted a form of governance expertise that Serafina was not going to waste on principle. They disagreed regularly and clearly and worked well together, which was approximately what Serafina had hoped for. Darius served on the External Affairs Council. He had resigned his Alpha King title in the first week without being asked to, transferring the formal authority to the new governance structure that Serafina was still in the process of fully designing. He'd shown up to the second council meeting with a detailed proposal for reforming the eastern trade routes, and she had read it carefully and approved 3 of the 7 points and sent the other 4 back with questions, and he had received that without flinching. She watched him, over those months, doing the work of becoming someone worth the title he'd given up. Not dramatically, daily. The unglamorous, sustained effort of a person rebuilding their integrity from the foundation rather than the facade. She had not forgiven him. Forgiveness, she had come to understand, was not a single moment. It was a practice, like the boundary territory walks, requiring repetition and patience and the willingness to be honest about where you were in the process on any given day. Some days she was further along. Some days she looked at him and felt the full weight of the platform again, the moment he'd stood still. She was honest with herself about both. That honesty, the capacity to hold the complexity without resolving it artificially into something simpler and easier to carry, was something she had learned in the passage, on the dais floor, in the 3 days in Marin's shop. Something she hadn't fully had before, though she'd thought she did. Real resilience, she had come to understand, didn't look like the thing the Empire had always called strength, the forward-facing, expressionless endurance of people trained to absorb damage without showing it. Real resilience looked like the willingness to fully account for the damage done, to yourself and by yourself, and to keep moving anyway. Not through the accounting, not around it, through it. The crescent on her palm was quiet now, not cold. She understood the difference now between absence and peace. It sat on her skin with the particular settled quality of something that had found its right use and was resting. It lit occasionally, in specific moments she was still learning to read, and she let it light when it needed to. On a morning in late autumn, she stood at the edge of the passage entrance in the Thornback Cliffs. She had come back 3 times since the festival. Not for instructions. The light woman on the dais had not appeared again after the night before the blood eclipse, and Serafina had understood that as its own kind of answer. She came back because the chamber with its 4 centuries of incised text was the most accurate record she had of what had been lost and what she was trying to rebuild. And she read differently each time she came, understanding more as the governance work gave her more context for what the old covenant texts were actually describing. She stood at the entrance and thought about the woman who had walked in here 3 months ago, the calculus she had run, what she could prove, what she could build, how to thread the needle and minimize damage and make the strongest possible case and still survive the doing of it. She thought about the moment that calculus had failed and she'd stopped running it, the moment the light woman had pressed 2 fingers against her sternum and she'd understood that some thresholds can't be approached carefully, that the preparation ends and then you simply have to become the thing the moment requires, and trust that the becoming doesn't destroy you, and do it anyway. That trust was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Harder than the platform. Harder than the fight. Harder than the months of daily governance work with its endless frictions and unsatisfying compromises, and the constant awareness of how much damage there was still to account for. Trusting that the becoming wouldn't destroy her. She was still here. The evidence suggested the trust had been worth it. She pressed her palm flat against the stone of the passage entrance, not to open it, just to feel the contact, the same mineral frequency, the same old certainty running through the mountain's bones. She stood there in the early autumn cold with her eyes closed and her hand against the stone, and she breathed. Slow, deliberate, the kind of breathing you do when you're not performing steadiness for anyone, when you're actually finding it. Then she took her hand off the stone, turned back toward the road, and walked back toward the work. There was always more work. She had stopped minding that. But in the capital, in the council hall, that had once been Celine's private receiving room and was now a working chamber with maps on every wall and a permanent smell of ink and cold tea, Ryle was reviewing the first draft of the new settlement compact. In the Eastern Territories, Liliane was home, in a village that was smaller than she'd remembered and more beautiful, helping her mother with something ordinary. In the Boundary Territories, common wolves were seen, for the first time in their recorded history, a council document that listed their names as signatories rather than subjects. And in the passage below the Thornback Cliffs, the walls with their 4 centuries of careful, patient truth sat in the dark, no longer waiting. Their purpose was walking in the world now. It wore a crescent scar on its right palm and had a council meeting in 2 hours, and was thinking about the grain distribution report as it came down off the mountain. The empire was gone. What was being built in its place did not have a name yet. That was all right. The best things rarely do, in the beginning. They just have people who are willing to keep showing up and doing the work, day after day, in the long, unglamorous stretch between the fire and the becoming. That was enough. That had always been enough.